Wealthy woman sues poor neighbor, then learns he owns her mansion. The golden light of dawn seeped through the grand bay windows of Eleanor Whitfield's sprawling estate, casting an opulent glow over the marble floors. Clad in an immaculate silk robe, Eleanor breezed through her breakfast nook, where an untouched plate of croissants and a steaming cup of tea awaited her. Yet, the serenity of her morning was shattered by the ringing of her phone. "Ms. Whitfield," came the voice of her lawyer, Harold Kensington. His tone was clipped, almost eager. "I've filed the lawsuit against your neighbor, Mr. Cooper. The court hearing is set for next week." Eleanor's crimson lips curled into a satisfied smirk as she delicately lifted her tea. "Excellent, Harold. It's about time someone taught that man a lesson. Imagine his unsightly shanty lowering the property value of my mansion. It's an affront to this entire neighborhood." A soft knock at the door interrupted her gloating. "Ma'am," her butler announced, holding a manila envelope delicately as if it were a dangerous artifact. "A letter from the council." With a slight wave of her hand, Eleanor took the envelope and dismissed the butler. As she peeled it open, her eyes scanned the paper, zoning appeals, neighborhood restructuring, legal jargon she barely cared to understand. Her world had always been one of control. Lawsuits like the one she had initiated were just another tool to maintain it. Just as she prepared to toss the letter aside, the sound of a lawnmower roared from the neighboring yard. Eleanor's eye twitched. She stormed to her window and glared at the source of her irritation, a modest, overgrown lot owned by Arthur Cooper, the pauper who'd been her bane for months. He worked tirelessly in the yard, his withered hands pruning hedges and cutting grass as though he took pride in the land she deemed an eyesore. The sight stoked the flames of her ire. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from her socialite friend Victoria. "Can't wait for the gala at your place tonight. Heard your neighbor might crash it, scandalous." Eleanor's grip tightened on her phone. She would not allow a man like Arthur to mar her reputation or disrupt her plans. Tonight was her moment to shine, to prove that Eleanor Whitfield still ruled over this affluent enclave. Little did she know, the events of the day were about to upend her carefully curated life and unravel secrets she never saw coming. Eleanor Whitfield's gala was the talk of the town. As the sun dipped below the horizon, luxury cars lined her circular driveway, depositing an endless stream of the city's elite into the grandeur of her mansion. Crystals shimmered on chandelier strands, reflecting off the polished floors and the exquisite gowns of the guests. The evening was a triumph of wealth and status, exactly as Eleanor had envisioned. From her vantage point at the top of the grand staircase, Eleanor scanned the room with a sense of satisfaction. Yet, as her eyes flitted toward the French doors leading to the garden, her mood darkened. Arthur Cooper stood just beyond the glow of the garden lanterns, his figure illuminated faintly in the distance. He wasn't dressed for the occasion, far from it. In his worn boots and plaid shirt, he was an unwelcome blemish on her perfect evening. "Harold," Eleanor whispered harshly, motioning to her lawyer who stood nearby nursing a glass of wine. "What is he doing here?" Harold followed her gaze and sighed. "I imagine he's making a point, Eleanor. You filed a lawsuit against him this morning. Perhaps he wanted to return the favor with his presence." Eleanor's jaw clenched. "Handle it. Now." As Harold descended the stairs to approach Arthur, Eleanor turned back to her guests, forcing a smile. She schmoozed with the mayor's wife and laughed at a CEO's tired jokes, all while sneaking glances toward the garden. Harold had reached Arthur, and though their conversation appeared civil from afar, Eleanor could sense the tension in Arthur's rigid stance and Harold's gesturing hands. Moments later, Harold returned, looking pale. "He refuses to leave," Harold admitted. "He says he's within his rights to be here since he's technically on public property near the road." And Harold hesitated. "And what?" Eleanor snapped. He mentioned something about reminding you who owns this land." Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you know what he means?" Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she dismissed the question with a wave. "Of course not. He's just trying to cause trouble. Ignore him." Despite her words, Eleanor couldn't ignore the nagging unease that settled over her. Arthur's words felt loaded, a veiled threat laced with knowledge she couldn't pinpoint. She spent the rest of the evening trying to shake off the discomfort, but as the night wound down and the guests began to leave, she found herself staring out into the darkness of Arthur's yard. The next morning, the chaos began. Eleanor woke to the sound of raised voices outside. Pulling on a robe, she stepped onto her balcony to see Arthur standing at the edge of her property line, surrounded by reporters. Cameras flashed as he held up a piece of paper, his voice carrying over the morning air. "This land isn't hers to take," Arthur declared. "I have proof that my family owns this property, and I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She hurriedly called Harold, who arrived within minutes, disheveled and carrying a briefcase. Together, they confronted Arthur, the media's cameras capturing every moment. Arthur handed Harold a document, a deed bearing an unfamiliar signature and a date that predated Eleanor's purchase of the mansion. "This can't be real," Eleanor insisted, her voice shaking. But as Harold examined the paper, his expression darkened. "Eleanor," he said cautiously, "if this is authentic, it could mean your mansion was built on land that legally belongs to him." The weight of Harold's words hit Eleanor like a blow. Everything she had fought to protect, her reputation, her standing in the community, her sense of control, was suddenly in jeopardy. And for the first time in years, Eleanor Whitfield realized she might not be the one holding all the cards. The revelation of Arthur's deed sent shockwaves through Eleanor's once untouchable world. For days, the local news outlets feasted on the story, splashing headlines like "Tycoon's Property Under Siege" and "David vs. Goliath in Suburban Showdown." Eleanor's mansion, once the crowning jewel of her affluent enclave, had now become a symbol of controversy. Reporters camped outside her gates, and social media buzzed with speculation, much of it unfavorable to Eleanor. Inside the mansion, Eleanor paced her drawing room, her stilettos clicking furiously against the marble. Harold sat at her mahogany desk, papers spread out before him. The deed Arthur had presented was being scrutinized by every expert Harold could muster, but so far, the results were inconclusive. "I can't believe this," Eleanor hissed, gripping the edge of the desk. "How does a man like that even afford legal representation? Who's funding this circus?" Harold cleared his throat delicately. "It seems the community has rallied around him. They've set up a crowdfunding campaign. The story of the poor but noble neighbor taking on the wealthy bully has gained traction." He hesitated before adding, "Eleanor, it's not looking good for your image." Eleanor shot him a glare that could freeze steel. "My image? Do you think I care about optics right now? This is my home, Harold. My legacy. Fix this." But fixing it wasn't so simple. As the days wore on, the tension between Eleanor and Arthur escalated into an all-out battle. Arthur, emboldened by the public's support, filed a formal claim with the county, demanding an investigation into the property's history. Eleanor retaliated by using her considerable resources to dig into Arthur's past, hoping to find something, anything, to discredit him. What she uncovered only complicated matters. Arthur wasn't just a poor neighbor with a grudge. He was the last descendant of the Cooper family, a line that had once owned vast tracts of land in the area before selling most of it off during hard times. The deed he presented wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a link to a long-forgotten chapter of the community's history. "This makes him a threat," Eleanor confided to Harold one evening, her voice low but charged with determination. "If that deed is legitimate, it's not just my mansion at stake. It's everything." She wasn't wrong. If Arthur's claims were held up in court, the legal ramifications could spiral beyond Eleanor's property. Other homeowners in the area, many of whom had purchased parcels from the same developer, could find their titles challenged. What began as a personal vendetta was rapidly evolving into a community-wide crisis. The stress took its toll. Eleanor's perfectly curated facade began to crack. She became short-tempered with her staff and withdrew from social events. Even Victoria, her closest confidant, dared to question her motives during a lunch meeting. "Are you sure this fight is worth it, Eleanor?" Victoria asked cautiously over a glass of Chardonnay. Maybe you should settle. Offer him a payout and make this go away quietly. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Settle? Do you know what that would look like? It would be an admission of guilt. No. I'll fight this to the bitter end. But the bitter end was drawing closer than Eleanor realized. Weeks later, the county's preliminary investigation returned a shocking result. The deed Arthur presented appeared to be authentic. The land on which Eleanor's mansion sat had indeed been part of the original Cooper estate. While the details were murky, it was enough to move the case forward to a formal hearing. The news hit Eleanor like a blow. She'd spent years cultivating her empire, clawing her way to the top of society, and now everything she'd built was teetering on the edge of ruin. Her enemies in the social circle began to whisper, and even her allies seemed to distance themselves, wary of the growing scandal. Meanwhile, Arthur's resolve only strengthened. He began holding public meetings at the local community center, sharing the history of his family's land and rallying support for his cause. Eleanor sent private investigators to disrupt his efforts, but each move only painted her in a harsher light. The final straw came on a rainy Thursday morning when a letter from the county courthouse arrived. The hearing date was set, and the media was already buzzing with anticipation. Eleanor stood at her window, staring out at Arthur's modest home as the rain lashed against the glass. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the letter, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a war, and Eleanor wasn't sure she could win. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Outside, the air was alive with the murmur of reporters and onlookers, their cameras clicking furiously as Eleanor Whitfield stepped out of her sleek black town car. Her expression was stoic, but beneath the composed facade, her nerves churned. She adjusted her pearl necklace as she ascended the courthouse steps, flanked by Harold and a small entourage of legal assistants. Inside, the tension was palpable. The gallery was packed, a mix of journalists, curious locals, and members of Arthur Cooper's growing band of supporters. Arthur himself sat at the plaintiff's table, his modest suit slightly wrinkled but his posture confident. A few feet away, Eleanor took her seat, exuding an aura of defiance despite the weight pressing on her shoulders. The presiding judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, called the court to order. The trial commenced with Arthur's attorney presenting the core of their argument. The deed Arthur's family possessed was valid and predates Eleanor's purchase of the land. Maps, historical documents, and expert testimonies were introduced, painting a picture of a family's legacy unjustly buried beneath decades of development and wealth. Eleanor's legal team countered with vigor, questioning the authenticity of the deed and accusing Arthur of fabricating his claim to extort money. Harold presented surveys, property transfers, and testimonies from real estate experts to cast doubt on Arthur's narrative. Yet, as the hours dragged on, it became clear that the weight of history was against them. The turning point came when an unexpected witness took the stand, Margaret Whitfield, Eleanor's estranged aunt. Eleanor's jaw tightened as the older woman approached, her withered hands gripping the edges of the stand. Margaret's testimony had been a last-minute development, one Harold had vehemently opposed. "Mrs. Whitfield," Arthur's lawyer began, "please tell the court what you know about the land in question." Margaret's gaze flickered to Eleanor before she spoke, her voice steady despite the murmurs rippling through the courtroom. "I remember when my father purchased that land from the Cooper family," she said. "It was meant to be temporary. They sold it under duress during the Great Depression, with the understanding that they'd have the chance to buy it back when times improved. But my father never honored that agreement." A sharp intake of breath swept through the room. Eleanor's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. "Are you saying the land was acquired improperly?" the lawyer pressed. Margaret hesitated but nodded. "Yes. Legally, it was theirs. Morally, it should have remained with the Cooper family. My father, our family, we took advantage of their hardship." Eleanor shot Harold a glare, but his expression was as stunned as hers. The damage was done. When it was Eleanor's turn to take the stand, she steadied herself, determined to regain control of the narrative. She painted a picture of her stewardship of the land, emphasizing her investments in the property and her contributions to the community. "I have poured my heart and soul into this estate," she declared, her voice trembling with calculated emotion. "It is more than a house. It is my home, a symbol of what I have built with hard work and determination. To have it stripped away over a piece of paper from decades ago, it would be an injustice." Arthur's lawyer rose for cross-examination, his tone respectful but firm. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you believe that financial success absolves one of moral accountability?" Eleanor bristled. "I believe in the rule of law," she replied sharply. "And the law is on my side." "And if the law rules against you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. As the proceedings entered their final phase, the judge's expression remained inscrutable. Closing arguments from both sides presented stark contrasts, one of historical injustice and rightful ownership, the other of modern legalities and personal investment. The gallery was silent as the judge adjourned to deliberate, leaving the courtroom awash in tension. Hours later, the judge returned, her gavel striking the bench to call the court back to order. All eyes were on her as she began to read the decision. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony," she said, her voice measured, "this court finds that the deed presented by Mr. Cooper is authentic and valid. The land in question legally belongs to the Cooper family." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Eleanor sat frozen, her world crumbling around her as Arthur's supporters erupted into quiet cheers and applause. The judge raised her hand for silence. "However," she continued, "given the significant investment made by Mrs. Whitfield and the complexities surrounding the property's history, the court recommends mediation to determine a fair resolution, including possible financial restitution or a negotiated settlement." Eleanor barely heard the rest. Her grip on her carefully curated life was slipping, and for the first time, she faced the reality that she might lose everything. Meanwhile, Arthur sat with quiet dignity, his expression one of vindication rather than triumph. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor approached Arthur, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. The two adversaries stood face to face, the gulf between their worlds never more apparent. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low but firm. Arthur met her gaze evenly. "No, it isn't. But maybe it's time we stop fighting and start talking." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a man who had forced her to confront the cracks in her foundation and the possibility of a new way forward. The days following the trial were a blur for Eleanor. Reporters hounded her mansion gates, asking for comments on the decision. For the first time in years, she declined interviews, retreating into the confines of her home. The judgment had left her in an unfamiliar position, vulnerable. A week later, she received a letter from Arthur, handwritten on simple stationery. It wasn't a gloat or demand, instead, it was an invitation. He proposed a meeting at the community center to discuss mediation, as the judge had suggested. At first, Eleanor considered ignoring it. But something about his words, calm, resolute, devoid of the bitterness she expected, made her reconsider. When she arrived at the community center, Eleanor was struck by how humble it was. The peeling paint on the walls, the mismatched chairs, it was a world away from her marble-floored mansion. Arthur stood at a plain wooden table, waiting for her. He rose when she entered, extending a hand. For a moment, she hesitated, then shook it, her grip firm. "Thank you for coming," Arthur said, his tone sincere. "I know we've been at odds, but I believe we can find a way forward." Eleanor sat, her gaze steady. "I'm here because I care about what happens next, to both of us. Let's talk." What followed was hours of candid conversation. Arthur shared the history of his family's land, their struggles, the broken promise, and what it meant to him to reclaim that legacy. Eleanor listened, her defenses slowly lowering. She, in turn, spoke of her investments and the deep connection she had developed with her home over the years. By the end of their discussion, they found common ground, both cared about the land, but for different reasons. In the weeks that followed, the two reached an agreement. Eleanor would retain her mansion but pay Arthur a significant sum for the land rights, enough for him to secure a new home and create a trust to preserve the Cooper family's legacy. In exchange, Arthur would relinquish his claim and publicly endorse the resolution. The media portrayed the settlement as a triumph of compromise, a rare example of civility prevailing over conflict. Eleanor's reputation, though tarnished, began to recover as the narrative shifted. She started attending community events, often alongside Arthur, who became a quiet but respected voice in local preservation efforts. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor found herself hosting a charity event on her estate. This time, the guest list included not just the city's elite but also members of Arthur's community. As she looked out at the diverse crowd mingling on her manicured lawn, she felt an unfamiliar sensation, pride not in her wealth, but in the bridges she had begun to build. Arthur approached with a cup of lemonade in hand. "You've done well here," he said with a small smile. "So have you," Eleanor replied. For the first time in years, the mansion felt like more than just a monument to Eleanor's ambition. It had become a symbol of reconciliation, proof that even the most entrenched divides could be bridged with understanding, effort, and humility. Months after the resolution, the estate no longer symbolized division but transformation. Eleanor Whitfield had embraced a role she never imagined for herself, a steward of community and heritage. The Cooper Whitfield Trust, established to honor the land's legacy, had become a model for reconciliation efforts in other communities. The trust funded preservation projects, local scholarships, and educational programs about the area's history. Eleanor still lived in her mansion, but it was no longer an isolated fortress. Its gates were open more often, hosting charity events, art exhibitions, and gatherings that blended her elite social circle with the wider community. For Eleanor, the changes were more than superficial, they represented a shift in how she viewed the world and her place within it. Arthur Cooper, too, found his life transformed. The funds he received allowed him to purchase a modest but comfortable home nearby, where he often hosted workshops about the importance of preserving history and standing up for one's principles. Though his life had been defined by struggle, he now carried himself with quiet pride, knowing his family's story would not be forgotten. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor and Arthur stood together at the dedication of a new community garden, located on a portion of the contested land. Children played among the flowers, and neighbors chatted over cups of cider. The plaque at the garden's entrance read, "To honor the past, embrace the present, and cultivate a future built on unity." As the ceremony concluded, a reporter approached Eleanor with a question. "Ms. Whitfield, what would you say is the biggest lesson you've learned from this experience?" Eleanor paused, her gaze drifting to the garden where Arthur knelt, helping a young girl plant tulip bulbs. "That wealth and power mean nothing if they're not used to uplift others," she said softly. "Sometimes, you have to lose a battle to win something far greater." The reporter scribbled furiously, but Eleanor paid no mind. For the first time, her words were not for the public, but for herself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Her journey had been far from perfect, but it had brought her to a place of meaning and connection, a legacy worth leaving behind.